For years, doctors were modern-day gods, revered, trusted, infallible. Now medicine is in crisis. Our gods have let us down. A rash of sensational cases has highlighted the profession's supposed deficiencies as never before. And with each case of medical error comes an instinctive response. Search for the guilty. Hunt down the doctor or nurse who blundered. Make them a scapegoat, and let that be the end of it.
I was the only one pretty much being singled out as being totally responsible for everything, and it was a very scary feeling.
There's absolutely no justification for putting staff at risk of making a mistake, and of course the patient at risk of being at the receiving end of a mistake.
I thought that I was super nurse in that hospital. There were many things in that hospital that I was the only nurse that was able to do them. I just really had no clue that I could make an error, especially one as serious as the one I made.
Initially, I thought what everyone else had thought. I thought, well, the must just have injected the wrong stuff.
I just felt bad. I still feel bad. And I remember the enormous difficulty that night as I tried to come to grips with what had happened.
But there is a fundamental problem with the instinctive blame the doctor approach. It does nothing to reduce the level of medical error, which is said to contribute to some 40,000 deaths each year in Britain. But now, a radical group of doctors has emerged with an idea that promises to slash this death toll. The group's remedy is based on what they call the systems approach. Behind this seemingly innocuous phrase is a revolution in medical thinking. They believe there is no such thing as simple human error. That mistakes happen for a number of complex reasons. Rather than simply blame the doctor, we should try and understand why mistakes happen. Only then can we begin to tackle medical error. Such radical thoughts are redrawing the moral map of medicine. In the process, they are turning 3,000 years of medical history on its head.
Somebody shake you by the lapels and say, be more careful, be more attentive, be less forgetful, and so on.
This recent British Medical Journal conference is a milestone. For the first time, Britain's top doctors are gathered to discuss the taboo subject of medical error.
The sheer human factors.
At this meeting, the radicals of the systems approach are getting a hearing. Slowly, their big idea is edging center stage. The penny dropped first in the United States. Medical error is as big an issue there as here. Now the American revolutionaries are in Britain to spread the word. The leading light is Don Berwick.
No one likes to talk about errors. We're a culture in which blame and personal responsibility are really stressed. People feel bad when they're involved in an error. Even if they don't think they caused it, they feel bad. We also don't have a deep understanding of the nature of systems. Errors really, in general, come from systems, from interactions, equipment, job designs, sequences. And although an individual is involved, it's not the individual alone that accounts for the error. We don't have a strong sense of that in our consciousness. So when something bad happens, we think we did it.
At the heart of the systems approach is the belief that most medical errors are the result of a combination of causes. They're not just the result of one doctor or nurse fouling up. Michelle Johnson qualified as a nurse in California in 1959. For over 25 years, she did her job quietly and without fuss. But one night in 1987, her world was turned upside down.
It was about 10 o'clock at night when one of my elderly patients began to go into acute congestive heart failure. So I went to get the medications, and because I was the only person caring for this lady and she was in such critical condition, I did gather my medication materials and go to the bedside to prepare the injection, rather than preparing it in the medication room where I should have done it.
Michelle's patient had been prescribed a diuretic, Lasix, to help her body get rid of excess fluid and relieve her breathing.
I began to give her the medication, and I'm talking to her and telling her that I'm giving her medications. I have to give it very slowly, but that it will help her breathing. And she was talking to me and saying, "Why can't I breathe?" While I was injecting the actual medication, she just went and ceased breathing.
An emergency team rushed to her patient's bedside.
And some nurse in the room picked up a vial and said, "What is this doing in here?" And I was on my knees in the bed doing CPR on the patient, and I said, "Oh my God, that must be what I gave." And it was potassium chloride.
One of the side effects of giving Lasix is that your potassium levels are reduced. For this reason, Lasix and potassium chloride are often given together, but the potassium is given in very dilute form and over a long period. Michelle's mistake was that she had given potassium chloride in its undiluted form. It killed her patient.
I blame myself so much. Doctors and nurses are supposed to be error-free, a little above the rest of the people, and I wasn't.
Michelle was asked to resign, and subsequently her nursing license was suspended. Years of exemplary service suddenly seemed to count for nothing. Michelle had become a liability and an embarrassment. All it had taken was a single error. Michelle had been nursing since she was 21 years old. How could somebody with so much experience make such a fundamental mistake? But examine her error with the techniques of the systems experts, and things start to look less black and white. Medication errors involving potassium chloride are common on both sides of the Atlantic. Professor David Upton in Leicester runs an informal reporting system.
This is a file of cuttings and case reports relating to deaths through the maladministration of strong potassium chloride injection. And this is just through the 1990s. We're aware of many cases stretching back beyond that. This is an issue that's been with us for a long time, and really it's taken us an acceptably long time to resolve this problem and safeguard the patients from the risks of strong potassium chloride.
Undiluted potassium chloride, the drug with which Michelle had mistakenly injected her patient, is one of the most dangerous to be found in any hospital.
Strong potassium chloride is so potent at disrupting the heart's normal rhythm and actually stopping the heart that in fact it's routinely used in those states in America that execute prisoners by lethal injection. This is the preparation that's principally used to bring about that death penalty in the US. We're in the clinical room of a typical general hospital ward, and this is the area where the drugs are stored and the area where nursing staff prepare drugs for administration to patients.
Recognizing the potential for mix-ups, some hospitals keep undiluted potassium chloride out of general circulation.
There are a number of of documented deaths resulting from the inappropriate administration of strong potassium chloride injection. This injection is lethal. Previously, in the UK, we used to store strong potassium chloride basically in with the other injectables, either in the general ward injection cupboard, or perhaps even worse, we've seen examples where the ampoules were emptied out and stored in bins or trays like this, ready for quick picking. It's an accident waiting to happen.
Reducing the risk of such an accident could hardly be simpler.
What we recommend is that we store the strong potassium chloride entirely separately in a controlled drug cupboard. And that's just a simple risk management strategy that we've adopted here.
Simple enough. But in the ward where Michelle worked, strong potassium chloride was not kept locked away. It was stored openly with other commonly used medications, including the diuretic Lasix.
When I went to get those medications, I went into a small closet area that we kept stocked medicines in a fishing tackle box. And on the front of each drawer was a little typed label stating what meds were in that drawer. I had been working there for 13 years, and you get used to where things are. Possibly I did reach into the drawer thinking that I knew exactly where the Lasix was. And because my patient was so ill, I had no one to help me with her, that I just grabbed quickly and ran and may have grabbed the potassium.
The way the strong potassium chloride was stored made the accident all but inevitable. The hospital's unsympathetic reaction to Michelle was surprising, given that in other departments, strong potassium chloride was kept well apart from Lasix, a tacit recognition of the dangers.
In the intensive care unit in my own hospital, they had separated those two drugs far away from each other because of the potential for error and the fact that errors had been made, and yet they had not done that on the unit that I worked on.
Bad organization is always likely to end in error. Yet Michelle's case was dealt with in the traditional way: blame the person involved. She was asked to resign. Deeply ingrained within the culture of medicine, error and incompetence are regarded as inseparable. Get rid of the failing doctor or nurse, and you get rid of the problem.
In every U.S. city and town, there is one house that everybody knows: the doctor's. Available here are the services of the man who by law is privileged to practice one of the most respected of all professions.
Medics have traditionally been seen as all-knowing and all-powerful.
It is the duty of each nurse, each assistant, to anticipate every need of the doctor in command. For on him now rests all responsibility.
The rites of medicine are a mystery, and when we surrender ourselves to its priests, we expect infallibility.
Whatsoever house I enter, there will I go for the benefit of the sick.
But doctors were never the gods we wanted them to be. Error is a part of human life, and doctors are no less human than the rest of us.
The word error itself usually is used to mean human error. It's the same thing in a medical environment that happens in our daily life. We forget our keys and leave them at home. We don't remember a phone number. We say something to someone else and are misunderstood. These are common failings in human performance. At home, they don't matter much, usually. In a complex medical environment, those errors hurt people. If we ever expect to solve it by asking physicians or nurses not to be human, we'll be missing the point. They're doing the best they can. Now we have to make the system safe for them to work in.
If you design into medicine systems that are resistant to the inevitabilities of human error, you're on the way to making things safer. It's a lesson other risky occupations learned a long time ago.
Aviation is 20 times safer today than it was 30 years ago, even though the skies are a lot more crowded. That hasn't happened by pleading with pilots to be more careful. They've always been quite careful. It's by making planes and systems and communication more and more fail-safe. The systems work properly even though people make mistakes, because they've been designed to catch the mistakes, to make it harder to make a mistake, and to recover very quickly when a mistake occurs. So we can get very, very high reliability in human systems if we think very carefully about designs.
Although pilot error is a factor in 80% of air crashes, it's almost never the sole cause. Accident investigators accept that human error is nearly always just part of a chain of contributory factors. Just like doctors, pilots used to be seen as gods. Now they're treated as human beings, and humans make mistakes. The job of the crash investigator is not to punish the pilot, but to unravel what went wrong. Then they can make changes that prevent the same accident happening again. This approach creates an environment in which pilots feel able to admit that they too are fallible.
In the classification of errors and the study of the epidemiology of errors, the term preventability arises. And,
Don Berwick's message to the groundbreaking British Conference on Medical Error is that medicine can move in the same direction, away from its traditional obsession with blame towards the construction of a system which prevents error following error.
Can you comment on that a little bit about?
As with aviation, the key is honesty. People have to feel able to come forward and report errors.
Thanks, Don.
Every modern safety system in high-hazard industries around the world relies on voluntary reporting. It's that rich source of information and reports that come from people about the errors they commit or observe or that they think could have happened that's the starting place for organizations to analyze how to make systems safer. If we don't know about them, we can't do anything about them.
While pilots have learned to report errors without fear, medicine still insists on shooting the messenger.
The biggest fear that any pharmacist should have is hurting somebody. The feeling I had when I found out that I could have been responsible for these terrible errors, it was just, it's the most sickening feeling I've ever had, and I was just devastated. I couldn't live with myself keeping a secret like that. I didn't want it to ever happen again. I decided the next day to report it. It was like I was a pariah. I could walk in and they would scatter. It was really, really a terrible feeling.
It is in the US that the radical doctors and their systems approach have gained their firmest foothold. But even there, enlightenment exists only in pockets. Hospital pharmacist Dennis Dunn knows this to his cost. When Dennis made a mistake, he owned up, exactly as the systems gurus tell you to. Indeed, without his candor, the hospital would never have known what had happened. But Dennis received no thanks. Instead, he found himself plunged into a nightmare world of injustice and recrimination. As the culture of blame sought to crush him, one man was to stand between Dennis and professional oblivion. When Dennis Dunn heard that 4 patients at his hospital had suffered respiratory seizures and were fighting for their lives, he knew that the 4 had one other thing in common. He had prepared their medication.
When I realized that the error responsibility was mine, it was one of the most devastating feelings I've ever had in my life. I've had relatives die, I've had brother die, I've had a lot of really, things that were really, really tragic, but this was probably right up there with the worst.
Dennis realized that instead of sending out a relatively harmless antibiotic, he had dispatched a potentially deadly paralyzing agent. Dennis talked to his wife, Kay, who is also a pharmacist.
We don't work side by side, but we've always worked in pharmacy in the same place. And I said, what are we going to do? And he said he was going to go and tell the truth and talk to the chief and tell her what happened. Denny was very, very nervous about it and very upset. More upset that, something had happened to the patients and that he might be responsible for this.
Dennis came forward and told his superiors that he thought he might have sent out the paralyzing agent instead of the antibiotic. One of the 4 patients had now died. Over the months that followed, Dennis began to fear that he was being singled out for blame by the hospital.
I had participated in a very tragic error, but all of a sudden it was coming down just to me. It's a real lonely feeling. I was the only one pretty much being singled out, being totally responsible for everything. The natural inclination is to pass it on down the line, and I was the one that provided them with the out.
But he was about to find out who his real friends were. His wife Kay was told to contact a man named Michael Cohen.
And so I looked up the number, called him, and sure enough, he answered the phone. And I just told him who I was, and he was totally aware of the incident.
She was distraught. She told me her husband was a good pharmacist and that he certainly didn't go to work to hurt anyone. And I understood that. And she felt that he was being treated unfairly. And when I heard the story, I absolutely agreed. And so I agreed to help whatever I could do. I promised.
Cohen is often the first port of call for medical professionals caught up in the aftermath of an error. He runs the Institute for Safe Medication Practices, an organization dedicated to spreading the new gospel of systems analysis. Cohen began to pick apart Dennis's case, searching for the chain of events which he suspected had been behind the drug mix-up.
We figured there were actually about 20 different things that we saw that went wrong, any one of which, had it not been in place, this error would have never gotten to the patient.
Michael Cohen catalogued the failures of the system he had identified. Although Dennis had undeniably sent out the wrong drugs, the paralyzing agent instead of the antibiotic, the death of the patient had been the result of a number of errors, of which Dennis's was simply the last. One thing struck Michael Cohen straight away. The packaging on the paralyzing agent and the antibiotic were practically identical. The antibiotic is on the left and the paralyzing agent on the right. Dennis didn't even know that the drug was in the hospital. He should have been told that it was now in his part of the pharmacy. Instead, the deadly paralyzing agent had turned up unexplained and unannounced. The confusing packaging of the paralyzing agent had already been at the root of fatal errors in other hospitals. Tipped off about this source of danger, the manufacturers had sent out red labels to stick on each bag of the paralyzing agent. The hospital had received a batch of the labels, but they had not been put onto every bag.
So many things that were in other people's control, not Denny's control, and yet no one did their job, and that's why this thing happened. It was a setup for Denny Dunn to make this error.
At the arbitration hearing which followed, Michael Cohen argued successfully that Dennis Dunn had not been to blame for the death of the patient. Dennis got his job back. but it all left a nasty taste in the mouth. One of the reasons Dennis had reported the error was that he was anxious there should not be a repeat. But having made his vital report, Dennis had found himself singled out for blame. A less honest man might have regretted having spoken up. After all, there had been no evidence of what had happened beyond his own testimony.
Okay.
Had Dennis not come forward, the cause of the incident might have remained a mystery. The hospital would not have had the chance to mend its broken system, and the potential for a repeat would have remained.
As long as we're blaming the individuals or blaming the hospital where these have happened, the people are going to be having trouble to openly and honestly communicate information about the error. And it becomes almost impossible to really understand the system-based causes because communication is shut down.
We're taught if you're a good doctor, and then the nurse is a good nurse, and the pharmacist is a good pharmacist, everything will come out all right. Well, that's not true. They depend on each other, and it's the interrelationships that matter. So when errors happen, it's often at handoffs and in complex parts of a healthcare system. No individual caused it. So we're working with the wrong theory. These are systems flaws. They're not bad people.
This operation. How long have you had to wait?
There remains a standoff between a medical profession reluctant to confront the causes of error and the reforming zeal of the system's advocates. But the experience of one group of doctors shows that the system's approach is more than just a fancy theory. The anaesthetists were the first to recognize they had a problem with medical error and the first to embrace the system's approach. The result is that today, undergoing an anesthetic is far safer than it was 30 years ago.
Off to sleep. Nice, slow, deep breaths. There we are.
The benefit is felt by patients and doctors all over the world, but the revolution began here in Boston, in the United States. Ellison Pierce became a doctor in Boston in the 50s, at a time when the medical profession still enjoyed unquestioned public respect. And of all the specialist disciplines, few were held in higher regard than his own, anesthesia. In fact, deaths under anesthetic at that time were commonplace, but professional arrogance and public ignorance helped conceal the unpalatable truth.
Patients 20, 30, 40 years ago were not nearly as questioning as they are now. And if the all-powerful surgeon or the all-powerful doctor or what have you came out and said to the family, he just didn't take the anesthesia, his heart stopped, we don't know why, they accepted it. We knew that anesthesia was sometimes unsafe, but what was thought is these errors, these occurrences, these catastrophes were almost inevitable. And what changed over the next 10 years was the recognition that these complications could be greatly reduced.
In the 1960s, Pierce took a simple yet radical step. He began to record instances of deaths that occurred as a direct result of anesthetic error. Typical of these was the case of an 18-year-old girl who died having her wisdom teeth extracted.
The surgeon was pulling the teeth, and some 15 or 18 minutes after the beginning of the anesthesia and during the surgery, the heart stopped in this young girl. And the surgeon, I think, first recognized that the bleeding was not normal because the blood was not bright red, it was very black.
Pierce's research revealed that anaesthetists kept making simple mistakes, and there was none simpler nor more deadly than the failed tracheal intubation. In simple terms, they were putting the breathing tube into the wrong hole.
The beginning of the anesthesia, the anesthesiologist put the breathing tube not into the windpipe, but into the esophagus. And the patient was not receiving any oxygen during this 15 to 18 minutes. this country, there were perhaps 2,000 of these kinds of deaths a year from having the tube in the esophagus instead of the trachea windpipe and not recognizing it.
Anesthetists of the time were not helped by the fact that techniques for monitoring patients had not really changed since the 1850s. They had no way to measure responses beyond simple observation of breathing and pulse. The anesthetists probably failed no more than any other groups, but when they did, there was nowhere to hide.
If there was an anesthesia accident, it was plainly obvious to everybody. The surgeon, the nurse, anybody in the operating room recognized that there was an error or a catastrophe involving anesthesia. If a surgeon had an error, it was hidden, not intentionally necessarily, but it just wasn't obvious.
As the death toll mounted, Ellison Pierce and the profession's other more enlightened figures concluded that many of these casualties were preventable. The American public realized the same thing, and from the 1970s began to sue anesthetists in record numbers. The crippling rise in malpractice insurance premiums that followed meant that anesthetists could not afford to ignore the problem. In 1983, Pierce became president of the American Society of Anesthesiologists. He used the power of the job to make some simple but groundbreaking changes. Though the term had yet to be coined, he became a pioneer of the systems approach, helping to construct a technological safety net for anesthetists so that inevitable human errors need not result in tragedy. A brilliantly simple solution came with the introduction of two basic monitoring devices that alerted anesthetists to any problem.
This is the pulse oximeter. This gives you the oxygen saturation. Very simply, the light shines through the finger and measures oxygen saturation in the hemoglobin. It tells you that the red blood cell is carrying a normal amount of oxygen. 97% is normal. The Kaplan graph measures carbon dioxide, and it takes the end of the breath gas here, takes it out through this tube and carries it into the machine. We've got a nice end tidal carbon dioxide reading here. As she breathes out, there's a nice flat trace there. As she breathes in, breathes out, nice flat trace, good lung function. 6.9, that's quite acceptable for a spontaneously breathing patient under anesthesia. I've had this before.
The two devices that came on the market really sort of revolutionized the safety of anesthesia because for the first time you were aware within moments if something went wrong with the oxygenation or breathing system in a patient.
Give her half of it. Give it.
Among other things, these machines made it much harder to kill a patient by mistaking the esophagus for the windpipe. Ellison Pierce reinforced these technological advances with strict rules on monitoring blood pressure, heart rate, and oxygen levels. In hindsight, it all seems obvious, but at the time it was the stuff of revolution. The proof was in the numbers. In the 1950s, the death rate from anesthesia was roughly 1 in 3,000. Today, such fatalities have been reduced 100-fold. In the United States, such conspicuous successes for the system's radicals have been few. But in the UK, they have been even fewer. An insight into why is provided by a 50-year-old legal case which resonates to this day. In 1947, 2 English farm labourers went into hospital for routine operations. Both ended up paralysed. The case baffled the finest medical and legal minds of the age. only in the light of the insights provided by the system's radicals would the tragedy be fully understood. Post-war England, a time when medical error was not an issue in the headlines. Yet 50 years ago there was a case that helps explain why Britain has been so slow in understanding why doctors make mistakes. Charles Roe's father, Cecil, had gone into hospital for a minor knee operation. Cecil should have been back at work within days. Instead, he left hospital a broken man.
When I lived here, it was the horseman, chief horseman like. Everybody used to muck in at the time, but everything, all the work on the farm round about, it was all done with horses at the time.
Charles Roe remembers how everything changed for his family the day his father Cecil caught his knee jumping a fence.
As he jumped over, hit his knee, well, it hurt him. Well, and over a period of time, it gradually got worse. So finally, he got into Chesterfield to have his cartilage out. And that's when the accident happened.
Charles and his mother went to visit his dad in hospital after the operation.
As we walked down the ward, we didn't know him. We didn't know him. His face was all twisted up. And when they showed us who he was, then we knew there was something the matter for my dad to look like that.
Cecil was paralysed from the waist down.
I think the first time they knew anything had happened was my mum went and she fell down the bed and it was a wet bed. Well, that wasn't my dad. And when she fetched somebody, well, and then all hell broke loose then. Because my mother at the time, she was a little bit fiery.
There had been a dreadful error. Cecil Roe would never walk again. Remarkably, there were 2 other patients who were paralysed that day at Chesterfield Hospital. All had undergone spinal anaesthetics prior to what should have been routine surgical procedures. In the absence of any understanding of systems analysis, the battle lines were drawn. Somebody had to be to blame. Attention focused on Dr. Graham, the man who had carried out the spinal anaesthetics. To be entitled to compensation, Cecil Roe and fellow victim Albert Woolley had to be able to prove blame. They had no choice but to go to court. Dr. Graham and the hospital were charged with negligence. The main task in court was the laying and avoiding of blame. Attempts to understand what happened took second place. Though nobody had any real idea what had caused the paralysis, the defense had to come up with a theory. The local anesthetic that had been injected into the victims had been kept in small ampules. The defense argued that these ampules had acquired invisible cracks through which the local anesthetic had been contaminated. The supposed contaminant was an alcohol called phenol, in which the ampules were sterilized.
Now, this is a selection of the ampules that were used about the time of Woolley and Roe's anaesthetic. When the ampoule was taken out of the phenol, the anaesthetist had to inspect it for visible breakages. And he inspected it and looked at it, and that looks perfectly all right. And this is in fact how the anaesthetist would have seen it. But they thought, despite the ampoule looking like this, that there were invisible cracks in the glass, and that through these phenol had seeped into this local anaesthetic. And really, it's quite unbelievable, but that's what they accepted.
The cracked ampule theory was fatally flawed. Even if cracks had existed and phenol had got into the anaesthetic, this would not have harmed the patients. In the 30s, phenol had been injected into the spine as a routine treatment for tetanus. Nevertheless, the court accepted the theory and agreed that since Dr. Graham and the hospital could not have foreseen this, they could not be held responsible. Dr. Graham was cleared, and then cleared again at appeal. But the case continued to hang like a cloud over Dr. Graham and the tight-knit world of British anesthesia. Nobody had really believed in the invisible cracks. So what could have caused the paralysis? Nottingham anaesthetist Dr. Chris Hutter had always been troubled by the case. 50 years on, he set out to try and solve the mystery. But crucially, Hutter did not restrict himself to what Dr. Graham might or might not have done. He examined the system as a whole.
They put the blinkers on and they were obsessed with ampoules. They didn't take the blinkers off and look at anything else. That was where they went wrong.
Chris Hutter dismissed the cracked ampule theory. Instead, he examined the possibility that the anesthetic had been contaminated in some other way.
Hold the needle firmly, resting your hand on the patient's back.
The obvious starting point was the needles and syringes.
Attach the syringe carefully so that you don't alter the position of the needle.
So I had to find out how on earth could the needles and syringes be contaminated. So I went and spoke to one of the old theatre sisters who was working at that time, you see. How could this have happened? What on earth could the contaminant have been?
A clue was that Cecil Roe had developed an ulcer at the point of injection. To Hutter, this suggested contamination by alkaline cleaning fluids used in the hospital.
One of our anaesthetic drugs, if you inject it under the skin, causes this ulceration, very alkaline. And the cleaning materials you use, caustic soda, are alkaline.
In the discussion, the theatre nurse reminded Chris Hutter that at the time surgical instruments were boiled in water to sterilise them.
I thought, good heavens, hard water in the sterilisers. If you've got hard water in a steriliser, you've got to descale.
The contaminant wasn't alkaline, it was acid. By mistake, the needles and syringes had been boiled in acid descaler.
Water goes in, and you boil it. Instruments go in the tray, in this case the spinal anaesthetic instruments, and then into the boiling water. And then in 1947 that would have been a 20-minute boil, and by the standards of the time they were considered sterile. Just like your kettle, if you are boiling tap water in the apparatus, if the apparatus is to function properly, it's got to be descaled. And for that you have to use an acidic descaler. So that would have been done in the evenings or at the weekends. And if they put the acid in, wait for it to descale, and normally it should be drained out here through the water drain. But in the case of Woolley and Roe, it's most probable that the acid was left inside.
Cecil Roe and Albert Woolley had almost certainly been paralysed by injections of anaesthetic contaminated with acid. The systems approach had found the solution to a 50-year-old puzzle. Woolley and Roe should have been compensated. But there is more to this story than the fate of two farm labourers. The case had a bearing on the way medical errors would be dealt with in Britain for many years to come. A key figure in this was Lord Denning, who presided over Charles Roe and Albert Woolley's appeal.
Denning went out of his way to emphasise the crack in the ampule and that this was an acceptable explanation for their paraplegia, and he had every sympathy for the two patients, but he also had a greater sympathy for the medical profession at the time. He's always had an antipathy of the American style of things, especially American litigation, and he in several of his cases throughout his life on the bench, he makes derogatory remarks about the American litigation system. And he was determined that this would not come into the English system.
The British medical profession believed they were increasingly vulnerable to legal action. It watched with horror the way that American doctors were dragged routinely through the courts. They believed the fledgling NHS could not survive a flurry of expensive legal actions.
The actual size of litigation and the number of cases that were being litigated in the States was rampant. I think it was over 900% increase over several years in the 1950s. And the spectre of that hanging over a fledgling NHS was too much to bear.
Denning was aware of his own role in this. In 1951, in the last major medical case, he had ruled against a hospital in the case of Cassidy, a patient who had been left crippled by a botched operation. The Woolley and Roe case gave him the chance to exorcise this ghost.
There were obviously pressures from various directions, as well as from medical people who were getting very concerned about the way litigation was going. It became known to him that the medical profession was anxious about the way things were developing, and Denning actually stated that in the next case they sought to allay the anxieties of the medical profession, and the next case turned out to be Woolley and Roe. You could say whether Woolley and Roe were the sacrificial lambs for this. The thing that's wrong with the system is that the fact that the medical profession were exonerated, but Woolley and Roe received no recompense and literally left the scene broken people.
Cecil Roe survived until 1956.
If they'd have said they were sorry, but he still didn't bear a grudge. Oh no, we did at the time.
The case of Woolley and Roe cast a long shadow. It set the tone for subsequent medical negligence cases.
Certainly after the Woolley and Roe case, there were some very strange cases that were appearing where patients who were obviously suffering from extremes of medical negligence were being fobbed off with very small settlements and no settlements at all.
Lord Denning had been determined to protect the fledgling NHS from the culture of medical litigation. In the process, he also erected a barrier to the true understanding of medical error. Today, doctors find themselves in the dock once more. Bashing the doctor has never been more popular. As the government and the medical profession work out how to move forward, they need to consider what they want. If they want easy headlines, then that's simple. Identify the doctors and nurses who make mistakes and punish them. There are plenty of them out there. But if they want to increase the safety of patients, then perhaps they should listen to the system's revolutionaries. Find out how hard that will be next week.